So, good afternoon, everyone. Hope that you've had a good day, and we'll go ahead and get started again, reminding you that I'm just going to go through the whole slideshow. It's only 10 slides, so we didn't get through a ton of information to begin with. So, uh, again, remembering our what we're here to learn about: retrieval cues, priming, serial position effect, context dependent, and state dependent memory. You wrote this yesterday, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Then we dealt with recall, recognition, and relearning. Where we left off was kind of remembering recall recognition, the fact that recall is like a essay question on a test, and recognition is like a multiple choice question on a test. Recognition is always easier than recall. We did the activity with the seven dwarfs. It was harder to come up with the seven dwarfs without the list of names where the names of the dwarfs were inside of it. Then we've also talked about relearning, so there's nothing too fascinating there. Just remembering that it is always easier to relearn something or um, remember something after you've learned it. This is where we kind of left off, dealing with this relearning time. One of the influential studies done by Ebbinghaus. I'm not 100% sure if he was in the 40 Studies book or not. Honestly, I've forgotten to this point, but if this looks familiar, it should. It's either in that book. You've also done something similar in previous modules with the Psych Sim, excuse me, activities. So if we're looking at relearning, proving that relearning is always easier than learning at the first point. This Ebbinghaus guy took a bunch of nonsense syllables, and this is a great example of where um, this shows what a nonsense syllable is. Just three letters put together that do not make a word. The important reason they don't make a word is because by making a word, that gives you an easier way to remember it. If it's just random letters, that makes it much more difficult. So what he did was give his subjects a list of these letters to memorize. And so he would say, here, memorize this list, look at it for X amount of time, and then you need to give that list back to me. So they would sit there and remember it and go forth. And what he found was the more times he rehearsed out loud on day one, the less time they needed to relearn or memorize the same letters on day two. The more time that they took to remember those letters on the first day, the less time it took to remember those letters on the second day. Meaning that memory was still in there. It may not have become immediately out, but it needed to just be pushed back out to in order to be retrieved. If you look at this graph over here, the number of repetitions on the first day, as it goes up, the time it took to relearn the letters on the second day goes down. I will sit here for a minute. What is this overall graph? It is showing the relationship between two variables. We call that what type of study? Giving you a minute to actually answer it. And hopefully by now you remember that that is a correlation, the relationship between two variables. And then I can say, hey, does that prove anything? Does that prove a specific causation? Does that mean without a doubt that the number of repetitions caused the lower time? Hopefully you're saying or thinking to yourself now, no, that does not prove causation, but it does show a relationship. It shows that they are related. Again, reviewing what correlation is, when you see a graph in which the line goes down from left to right, or when you see one variable increasing and the other one decreases, we call that what type of correlation? And hopefully we remembered or have said by now that is a negative correlation. If they both go up at the same time, that is a positive. If one goes down while the other goes up, that's negative. When there is no relationship, the line is either straight vertical, straight horizontal, that's no relationship or unrelated. So we know for a fact, based on this information, that there is a relationship between repetition, between rehearsing, learning. Remember, we talked about studying is nothing more than rehearsing. And the fact that then it took less time to relearn it, so that memory is there. Showed this yesterday in class. This is kind of quickly where we left off, dealing with the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer song and the fact that it was easier to remember the reindeer names as opposed to the dwarf names because we have a song, something that cues us, something that gives us an idea or something, a way that makes us remember something else. Let's think back. We talked about in storage exactly how our brain stores information, and that information is stored in very complex, jumbled up neural networks that touch each other. And what did I say? When you want to really remember something that's brand new, what's the best thing that you can do? You can attach it to something else that you already know. Because when you think of that other thing, you are unconsciously activating the memory of the new thing. So when we looked at this, memory is not stored as a file, right, that can be retrieved searching alphabetically. We don't sit there and go through again pages of books looking for something in our memory. It's stored in a web of associations: conceptual, contextual, emotional. And we've talked about emotional. We've talked about how emotional memories bring about both the object, the thing that elicits the memory, and the emotion itself, because they get earmarked together, they get hashtagged together. You can also think of contextual memories, such as memories of a specific class at St. Mary's Riken might also make you think of other classes that you've had that's in the same context, right? Because that common link of the classroom. You have conceptual memories, again, giving you that link of associated concepts. Right? Go back to our bird and penguin. Part of the reason that penguin can be so easily confused with not being a bird is because it doesn't tie into that conceptual web that we've created in dealing with what exactly a bird is. So that's how memories are stored and then retrieved, because they can be cued by the other thing. We can be cued to remember Mr. DeLuca's class when we think about Mrs. Wood's class, because we're in the same classroom. So if you had Mrs. Wood's class as a sophomore usually, then by thinking about her classes, you may be cued to remember my classes because you have us in the same classroom. Priming refers to the trigger of a thread of association that brings about a concept. This is great examples, and I'm going to go back to this slide, but I'm going to go to the first slide back again and use this diagram to explain priming. Okay? If we see or hear the word rabbit, if we think about a rabbit, we read a story about a rabbit, fill in the blank, doesn't really matter. Anything that has to do with a rabbit, that word elicits a visual picture. And remember, we think about, going back, we think in pictures, we do not think in words. So when we hear the word or see the word rabbit, we create a mental picture. Well, when somebody then says to you, hey, spell the word hare for me, if we've just recently thought of a rabbit, we're actually going to think of the word hare like a rabbit, H-A-R-E. That's the natural tendency. We're not going to think of hare as the thing on your head. Yeah? So, I'm sure you've heard these jokes or these riddles, however way you want to think about it. You have somebody say, go 5 times fast. And you say, right after they finish the 5th word, you say, what do you do at a stoplight? And they're right there thinking about go. I'm sorry, I screwed up the joke. If you make them think about go and then you say, what do you do at a red light? And they think go. They think green, they think go, because that's what they're used to thinking. Where in actuality, you've tricked them to realizing that you said, what do you do at a red light, which is actually stop. There's a lot of different ways to do that. That all has to do with this priming idea. The way the brain is primed, and that's the where the term comes from, to think in a specific way. One idea triggers the thought of another idea. If I was to show you this is actually, let me slide this over here for a second, and we have a tree and a dog. If I was in the actual display mode and I click through this and it says, define the word bark, and that would be the first picture you'd see. Because you see that picture, you're thinking bark like a tree. Then if I was to click it again, you get that picture over top of it, and now you're thinking primed bark like a dog. So again, where something can kind of create the idea, the thought of how exactly you're going to view any given subject. Power of priming, and I'm going to move these pictures because they take up. I can't move that one. I moved the one that I really needed to. Priming has become called invisible memory because it affects us unconsciously. You're usually primed outside of your conscious awareness. You normally aren't thinking about or you don't notice that you're being primed to remember things in a specific way. We talked about, the last slide, bark versus tree versus bark versus dog. Our thoughts are channeled based on the picture that was in front of us. We may have biases and associations stored in our memory that also influences our choices. And here's some studies that are probably interesting. People primed with money-related words were less likely to help another person. It's interesting. What if you really kind of sit there and think about that, well, why is that? Well, usually when we're thinking about money, we're usually in a selfish frame of mind. We're thinking about, we want that. That's something that we desire to have and don't wish to share with others. And so therefore, that priming affects your actions, your disposition the rest of the day. So therefore, you go through the rest of the day with the disposition, with the priming, selfish nature. And so that's how one way that primed memory can create behaviors or can influence behaviors. Priming with an image of Santa Claus lets kids to share more candy. The opposite effect of money, right? Santa Claus, the perfect example of an individual who selflessly gives every year and doesn't ask for anything in return other than for you to be nice. And so when the kids gain that image, they're primed to think of that. I mean, what other image could we use as a Catholic school as opposed to Santa Claus that would do this? Think of Jesus as a way that we could prime our way to influence behaviors of a Catholic, of somebody of faith. Use religious symbols. These are all ways that you could prime an individual to act in a specific way. People primed with a missing child poster then misinterpret ambiguous adult-child interactions as kidnapping. A little bit harder to understand. So if we were to see that picture, the old "Have you seen me?" You've seen them, you know them. Then basically we're looking for child molesters, pedophiles, kidnappers everywhere. So when we start to look everywhere, we get a self-fulfilling prophecy here. We start to assume that all adult-child interactions that are a little ambiguous are, is that person hugging that child? Is that their parent? Oh, I don't know about that. Maybe that they're going to try to kidnap them. So that's what that's getting at. Again, that specific power for us to interpret a situation based on just seeing a simple poster. Context dependent memory. Touched about this about a little bit, and the fact that it was a really good thing years ago when we decided as a school to change your midterms to be taken in the class that you took them in. It is always easier to retrieve memories in the context that you gained the memories. So we look at here, words learned underwater are better retrieved underwater. Because part of that web is the context, the place that you learned it. So we retrieve our memory more easily when in the same context as when we form that memory. I don't know about this necessarily. Did you forget a psychological concept? Just sitting down and opening your book might bring the memory back. Possibly. I would say maybe going to Edmodo for this class might bring a memory back about this class, or seeing something on TV or in a movie might bring memories of this class. So again, just the context is part of that web, and that web is activated when any piece of that web is activated. And so, context dependent memory, always easier to remember in the same location, in the same setting, in the same type of environment that you learned it in the first place. If you want to take this to the next level, think about school and home as two distinct environments. You have been taught, hopefully, as a young child about manners and behaving and things of that nature, but you were taught in the context of home. You weren't taught necessarily in the context of school. So then when you go to school, you might not easily remember exactly how you should act in any given situation. So that's kind of a way to take it to the next level, as opposed to, yeah, I learned it in the same place and I remembered it in that place. That's great, Mr. Luco. What does that do with real life? State-dependent memory. It is easier to remember memories formed in a specific emotional state when you are in that specific emotional state again. Okay? So this is talking about how memories are not just linked to the external context, but they're also linked to internal context in the emotional state. It is easy to remember things that made you angry when you are angry again. It is easy to remember things that made you happy when you are happy again. Part of the reasons that emotions build on themselves. They build on themselves because when you are happy, you think happy, you remember happy things, so on and so forth. When you're mad, you think mad things, you remember mad things, all that good stuff. Okay? Memories can also be linked to physiological states. I wonder if you mind giving me directions. I've never been sober in this part of town before. That joke gets to a point that I will make very clear. You are more likely to remember things intoxicated if you learn them while you are intoxicated. Because again, that web that's associated to that thing. Now, I emphasize the point that you had to be intoxicated when you learned it. No, drinking does not increase your memory span. So what this slide is getting at is this gentleman would have remembered just fine where he was going if he wasn't sober. But since he's sober, he can't remember it because he didn't learn it when he was sober. That's just a fun way to remember this, but it's tied to any physiological state: depressed, hypnosis, sleeping. Although it's difficult to learn anything sleeping, but that's the one that came to my head. So it's also called mood congruent memory. In case you see that term, it's the same thing as state dependent memory. Last slide today deals with serial position effect. Very simple. It's really, really easy. If you're given a long list of things to remember, you are more likely to recall the beginning and the end than you are the middle. Or inversely, you're more likely to forget what's in the middle than what's on the two ends. It's actually a combination of the primacy and recency effect. If you remember the words at the beginning, that's the primacy effect. You remember the words at the end, that's the recency effect. If we look at this graph and we see positions, this is the results of individuals and what words they remembered in their position in the graph. Okay? When we do immediate recall, they had to recall the words right after the list was read. We can see they remembered the beginning, then it dropped off, and then it spiked up at the end. That's the recency effect, that extreme spike. Okay? If you think about it, this is logical. This is the interaction of our long-term and short-term memory. We get the beginning of the list, we rehearse the beginning of the list to try to remember it, so therefore we're not paying attention to the middle of the list. And so that goes to long-term memory. This gets ignored or missed. And then this is in our short-term memory. It's something that we can easily pull back because it just happened. If we do later recall, in the fact that you weren't asked to recall something specifically right then, we see only the existence of the primacy effect because that short-term memory goes away. It dies. It flows out of the cup, if you remember our analogy of short-term memory. So you're dealing with later recall there, dealing with the primacy effect. One example of this that we would do if I was there is the list of presidents. And what I'd ask you to do is write down as many presidents as you can remember. And actually, you have time in this class to go ahead and do this activity. So why don't you start now and write down as many presidents as you can remember. I would encourage the instructor right now to just hit pause and wait a minute, or wait for the students to try to write down as many presidents as they can. So as you probably have hit play by now, I am going to pull up a list of presidents. If you haven't by now, hit pause. Please do so. Let's do it the easier way. That's not what I want. Bear with me a second. There it is. So what you can do is, as we go through this list, you can, or somebody in the class can sit there and say, okay, count the number of students who remember George Washington. Count the number of students who remember John Adams, so forth and so on. You don't have to worry about the vice president on this list. So go ahead and go through each one of the presidents. All right, if you run out of class time, no big deal. And go forward and see how many you remember. And again, I'd go ahead and hit pause at this moment and allow them to accomplish this task. Somebody just needs to take the lead in counting up the students who raise their hand. So go ahead and hit pause, and I'll wait for a minute and then pick up my point, assuming that you've completed the counting of hands. So at this point, I assume you've hit play and you're dealing with, they have a list of the presidents and who remembered which president. Look at those numbers as they go in chronological order. I would bet that the numbers at the beginning are high, the numbers at the end are high, the numbers in the middle, not so much. Right? Except for some notable exceptions, because they have tied into a retrieval queue into another web, regardless of what that web is. Usually that web, because U.S. history is normally taught war by war, we normally remember the presidents that had to do with major battles, major wars. Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, although he can be remembered for other reasons. Woodrow Wilson in the First World War. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the Second World War, although he can be remembered in for other reasons. We could also remember presidents because of, interesting little facts about them. William Henry Harrison could be remembered the fact that he was only the president for about 6 months because he died 6 months into office. Um, you could remember Grover Cleveland as the only president to serve as two non-consecutive terms. And yes, you should have put Cleveland twice if you wanted to count it both times. You could remember, where is he? William Howard Taft, and that's the funny one. He was a very large president, and the story goes about him is they had to special order a bathtub because he got stuck in the bathtub at the White House. So you could remember that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the only president to serve more than two terms. Truman as the president who dropped the atomic bombs. Eisenhower because of his service. Kennedy because he was assassinated, although many presidents were assassinated. That tends to be the one to be more easily remembered. So those presidents get remembered because there's another retrieval cue. Right? So that's it for this lecture. Hopefully you got through it all. If not, no big deal. And you can take the rest of the class if there is any class left over to do any other work or just behave for the sub, please. There won't be an exit slip or a vocabulary quiz tonight. We'll just go straight into the final module tomorrow. I'm sorry, tomorrow, on Friday. And I will hopefully be back then. Hopefully my son is feeling better and everything will go okay. So have a great night, and I'll see you in the morning.